On April 29, 1945, Private First Class Leon Bass stood at the entrance to Buchenwald concentration camp, 21 years old, from Philadelphia, and he was looking at something that would change how he understood everything. Bass was part of the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion, an all-black unit that had been fighting across Europe since D-Day. The Army had assigned his unit to provide support during the liberation. What Bass saw that day, the skeletal prisoners, the crematoriums, the evidence of industrial genocide, made him realize something profound. He had spent his entire life being told by white Americans that black people were inferior, subhuman, dangerous. Now he was standing in a place built by white people who had convinced themselves that certain humans weren't human at all. The U.S. Army in 1945 was still completely segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units, ate in separate mess halls, slept in separate barracks. They had fought across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany, but always apart from white soldiers. The Army told them this was necessary, that integration would cause problems. That white soldiers wouldn't accept them as equals, that the German people, especially German women, would be hostile to black soldiers because of Nazi racial ideology. Army pamphlets distributed to black troops before they entered Germany warned them explicitly, German civilians have been indoctrinated to see you as inferior. Expect hostility. Expect rejection, keep your distance. The Army was preparing black soldiers for a hostile occupation in a country that had spent 12 years being told that non-Aryans were subhuman. What the Army didn't tell them was that Nazi propaganda had been more complicated than simple hostility. Yes, the Nazis had classified black people as racially inferior, but many ordinary Germans had never met a black person. Their understanding came entirely from propaganda, and that propaganda had been contradictory. Jesse Owens had won 4 gold medals at the 1936 Berlin Olympics while Hitler watched. German audiences had watched American films featuring black performers. And after the war, when black American soldiers began occupying German cities, something unexpected happened. The hostility the Army had warned about didn't materialize. Instead, German civilians, particularly women, approached black soldiers with curiosity, friendliness, and sometimes genuine warmth. This wasn't what anyone had expected. Not the Army, not the soldiers, and certainly not the white American command structure that had spent decades maintaining segregation. The U.S. Army responded immediately with new regulations. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, was under pressure from Southern congressmen who were horrified by reports of black soldiers socializing with white German women. The Army issued orders restricting fraternization. Black soldiers received explicit warnings. Relationships with German women would result in court-martial. White military police began patrolling areas where black soldiers were stationed, looking for violations. But the regulations revealed something the Army didn't want to admit. They weren't trying to prevent fraternization with enemy civilians. They were specifically trying to prevent black soldiers from forming relationships with white women. White American soldiers faced no such restrictions. The Army's concern wasn't about fraternization with Germans. It was about maintaining the racial hierarchy that had governed American society since slavery. By summer 1945, the Army was facing a public relations crisis back home. Southern newspapers ran headlines about black soldiers fraternizing with German women. Congressmen demanded investigations. White soldiers sent letters home describing black troops socializing with German civilians, while white soldiers faced resentment from Germans who saw Americans as occupiers. The racial logic was twisted. Black soldiers who had been told they would face the worst hostility were receiving the warmest welcome. White soldiers who had expected to be treated as liberators often encountered cold shoulders from Germans who associated them with bombing campaigns and occupation authority. This reversal threatened fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy. If black soldiers could be accepted, even welcomed by white Europeans, what did that say about American segregation? The Army's response was to double down on restrictions targeting black troops specifically. Despite the regulations, relationships continued to form. In Stuttgart, a black supply sergeant named William Johnson met a German woman named Hildegard while distributing rations to civilian population centers. In Frankfurt, a military policeman named Robert Townsend started teaching English to German refugees at a displaced persons center, where he met Elizabeth, a former schoolteacher. In Munich, a combat engineer named Thomas Green helped repair a bombed church where he encountered Maria, whose husband had died on the Eastern Front. These weren't illicit affairs or violations of orders. They were human beings meeting in the aftermath of catastrophe, finding common ground in shared experiences of loss and survival. But to the Army command structure and to American society, they represented a fundamental threat. Interracial relationships between black men and white women, the absolute taboo of American racial hierarchy. The army began conducting investigations. Black soldiers who were seen regularly with German women were called in for questioning. Where had they met her? What was the nature of their relationship? Did they understand the regulations against fraternization? The interrogations were meant to intimidate, to remind black soldiers of their place in the hierarchy. But something interesting happened during these investigations. German women began defending the soldiers. When military police questioned Hildegard about her friendship with Sergeant Johnson, she told them plainly that he had been kind to her children, had helped repair her damaged apartment, and that she would continue to welcome him. The army could court-martial soldiers. They had no authority over German civilians. The women knew this. Some had lost husbands and fathers in the war. Many had experienced violence during the Soviet advance. Black American soldiers, in contrast, had treated them with dignity. By August 1945, something remarkable was documented in Army reports. Black soldiers were receiving marriage proposals from German women, not one or two isolated cases, dozens. The Army Chaplain Corps was overwhelmed with requests for authorization to marry. Each request required approval from commanding officers, investigation of the German civilian's background, certification that she wasn't a Nazi Party member, and verification that the soldier understood he was violating social norms. The marriage approval process could take 6 months to a year. Many couples went ahead with German civil ceremonies which the army refused to recognize, but the requests kept coming. German women were willing to face ostracism from their own communities. Black soldiers were willing to risk court-martial. What emerged from the devastation of post-war Germany was something nobody had predicted. Genuine human connections that defied both Nazi racial ideology and American segregation. Then came the backlash. In January 1946, the Army issued General Order 97, officially banning marriage between occupation forces and German nationals. The order applied to all soldiers, but enforcement focused disproportionately on black troops. White soldiers who had formed relationships often received waivers or were quietly transferred. Black soldiers faced immediate disciplinary action. Sergeant William Johnson was court-martialed for conduct unbecoming after military police found letters from Hildegard in his footlocker. He was reduced in rank and transferred to a labor battalion. Private Robert Townsend was given a choice: end his relationship with Elizabeth immediately or face dishonorable discharge. The message was clear. Black soldiers who had fought for American freedom in Europe were still subject to Jim Crow restrictions. The Army would rather destroy soldiers' careers than allow interracial relationships to continue. Victory over fascism abroad hadn't changed racial hierarchy at home. To understand why this happened, you have to understand the Rhineland bastards. After World War I, French occupation forces in the Rhineland included colonial troops from Senegal and Morocco. Some German women had relationships with these soldiers. Children were born. The Weimar Republic registered approximately 600 of these mixed-race children. When the Nazis came to power, they declared these children a threat to racial purity. In 1937, the Gestapo rounded up the Rhineland children, most were teenagers by then, and forcibly sterilized them. Not imprisoned, not deported, sterilized. The Nazi obsession with preventing mixed-race reproduction was so intense they violated children's bodies to prevent future contamination. So when American propaganda told black soldiers that Germans would be hostile to them because of Nazi racial doctrine, there was historical truth to it. But the actual experience of ordinary Germans was more complicated. The reality in post-war Germany was collapse. By May 1945, German cities were rubble. Berlin was 70% destroyed, Hamburg 75%, Munich 50%. The infrastructure, water, electricity, food distribution had stopped functioning. The Nazi government had evacuated or conscripted most able-bodied men. Women and children were left in destroyed cities with no resources. When American occupation forces arrived, they brought food, medicine, coal for heating. Black soldiers in supply units were often the first Americans that German civilians encountered. These weren't combat troops. They were logistics specialists, engineers, medics. They distributed rations, repaired water systems, established medical clinics. To German women trying to keep their children alive through the winter of 1945-46, these soldiers weren't representatives of an inferior race. They were men with the power to help, and many chose to use that power with compassion. But black soldiers also faced unique disadvantages. The Army assigned black units primarily to service roles: supply, transportation, engineering, graves registration. Combat roles were largely reserved for white units. This wasn't because black soldiers lacked ability. It was deliberate policy based on racist assumptions about intelligence and courage. The 92nd Infantry Division and 93rd Infantry Division were all black combat units that saw limited action. Most black soldiers never saw frontline combat. They built bridges, transported supplies, buried dead. The irony was that this relegated status actually facilitated more civilian contact. Combat units moved frequently. Service units stayed in place, worked alongside German civilians on reconstruction projects, developed ongoing relationships. The Army's racist assignment policies inadvertently created conditions for exactly the interracial contact the Army wanted to prevent. Structural racism defeated its own purpose. Command structure was fragmented. The European theater of operations had separate chains of command for white and black units. Orders issued to white regiments didn't always reach black units with the same urgency. When General Order 97 banned marriage with German nationals, white units received immediate enforcement. Black units sometimes didn't receive official notification for weeks. Some commanders chose not to enforce the order strictly. Colonel Marcus Ray, commanding officer of a black transportation battalion in Frankfurt, believed the fraternization ban was unenforceable and morally wrong. He told his officers to focus on military duties, not soldiers' personal lives. Other commanders, particularly Southern white officers assigned to black units, enforced regulations with zealous racism. The inconsistent enforcement created confusion and hope. Maybe the regulations weren't absolute. Maybe individual commanders had discretion. Maybe relationships could survive if commanders looked the other way. By late 1946, disillusionment was spreading among black soldiers. They had fought to defeat a racist ideology in Europe. They had seen the concentration camps, seen what happened when governments declared certain humans subhuman. They had liberated Europe from fascism. Now they were being told they couldn't form relationships with white women because of their race. The contradiction was unbearable. Corporal James Davis wrote a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier, one of America's leading black newspapers. "We defeated Hitler's racism with guns. Now we face American racism with regulations." What did we fight for? The letter was published. The Army investigated Davis for undermining morale. He was transferred to a supply depot in France and told that speaking to the press without authorization was grounds for court-martial. The message to black soldiers was clear: keep quiet about the racism you experience or face consequences. The NAACP and other civil rights organizations pressured the Army to change policies. They argued that black soldiers had earned the right to marry whom they chose through their service. The Army's response was to form a committee to study the fraternization issue. The committee held hearings in Washington in March 1947. Black veterans testified about discrimination in enforcement of marriage restrictions. German women submitted affidavits describing how black soldiers had treated them with respect, while white American soldiers had sometimes been violent or demeaning. The committee's final report acknowledged disparate enforcement but recommended no policy changes. Instead, the report suggested that interracial marriages would create problems when couples returned to the United States, particularly in southern states with anti-miscegenation laws. The Army's position was that preventing interracial marriages wasn't racism. It was protecting black soldiers from the racism they would face at home. For Sergeant William Johnson, the personal cost was devastating. After his court-martial and reduction in rank, he was transferred away from Stuttgart and Hildegard. The Army confiscated their correspondence. Johnson wasn't allowed to communicate with her. Hildegard didn't know where he had been sent. She wrote letters to the Army requesting information about his location. The letters were filed away unanswered. Johnson spent months not knowing if Hildegard believed he had abandoned her. He couldn't sleep, lost weight. His performance reviews noted lack of focus and apparent depression. An Army psychiatrist diagnosed him with anxiety reaction and recommended rest. But Johnson didn't need rest. He needed to be allowed to contact the woman he loved. The Army's position was that his emotional distress was self-inflicted. He had violated regulations, and these were the natural consequences. Then something unexpected emerged from Army records. A researcher studying post-war occupation policies discovered that German women married to black American soldiers reported lower rates of domestic violence than German women married to white American soldiers. The data came from German civil police reports and medical records. Between 1945 and 1948, German authorities documented 847 cases of domestic violence involving American soldiers and German women. Of those, 89 involved black soldiers, approximately 10.5% of cases. But black soldiers represented 11% of American forces in Germany. White soldiers were overrepresented in domestic violence statistics. Black soldiers were underrepresented. The researcher published this finding in a sociology journal. It contradicted racist assumptions that black men were more violent, more dangerous. The Army never officially acknowledged the study, but it circulated among civil rights advocates and military reformers as evidence that opposition to interracial relationships was based on prejudice, not protection. By 1948, the Army was under increasing pressure to reform. The presidential election was approaching. Black voters, particularly in northern cities, were demanding civil rights reforms. President Truman knew he needed black electoral support. In July 1948, Truman issued Executive Order 9981, mandating desegregation of the armed forces. The order didn't specifically address marriage restrictions, but it established a principle: racial discrimination in military policy was no longer acceptable. The Army began slowly processing marriage applications from black soldiers and German women that had been pending for years. Sergeant Johnson's application, filed in 1946, was finally approved in November 1948. By then, he hadn't seen Hildegard in over 2 years. He sent her a telegram. The response came 3 weeks later. She was still waiting. She had never stopped waiting. They were married in Stuttgart in January 1949, 3.5 years after they met. But success brought new problems. As marriages between black soldiers and German women became more common, American segregationists escalated their opposition. Southern congressmen introduced bills to ban military personnel from bringing foreign spouses to the United States if those marriages violated state anti-miscegenation laws. The bills didn't pass, but they revealed the extent of resistance. Some southern states refused to recognize marriages between black soldiers and white German women. When couples tried to settle in states like Mississippi or Alabama, they faced legal harassment, housing discrimination, employment barriers. The Army offered no support. Once a soldier was discharged, his marriage was his personal problem. Many couples chose to remain in Germany rather than face American racism. Others moved to northern cities, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, where interracial couples faced less overt hostility but still encountered discrimination in housing and employment. The winter of 1948-49 was brutally cold in Germany. Coal shortages meant many buildings had no heat. Food rationing continued. The Berlin blockade had begun in June 1948, escalating tensions between American and Soviet forces. Germany was becoming the front line of the Cold War. Military families, including those in interracial marriages, faced both material hardship and geopolitical uncertainty. Would American forces remain in Germany? Would families be allowed to stay together? The uncertainty was compounded by practical challenges. Housing shortages meant married soldiers often couldn't find accommodation for their wives. The Army provided housing for officially recognized military families, but many interracial couples' marriages weren't recognized by all Army commands. Some couples lived in German civilian housing, separated from military support systems. Others lived in displaced persons camps. The physical and bureaucratic environment seemed designed to make these relationships fail. British occupation authorities had different policies than American forces. British Army regulations allowed marriage with German civilians with command approval, without racial restrictions. French forces, which included colonial troops from Africa, also permitted interracial relationships. Soviet forces operated under their own separate system in the Eastern Zone. The different policies created tension among Allied occupation authorities. American commanders complained that other allies were undermining discipline by allowing what the U.S. Army prohibited. But the real source of tension was that British, French, and Soviet attitudes highlighted American racial hypocrisy. How could the United States claim moral leadership of the free world while maintaining segregated military forces and prohibiting interracial marriage? Soviet propaganda exploited this contradiction effectively. Radio broadcasts from East Berlin featured interviews with black American soldiers describing discrimination they faced. The Cold War was beginning, and American racism was becoming a propaganda liability. Corporal Robert Townsend had a different strategy. After the Army gave him the ultimatum, end his relationship with Elizabeth or face discharge, he chose discharge. In March 1947, Townsend requested early release from service. The Army granted it immediately, perhaps hoping to make an example of him. Townsend stayed in Germany as a civilian. He found work with the Civilian Occupation Administration, married Elizabeth in a German ceremony, and lived in Frankfurt. When other black soldiers heard about this, some followed his example. Why fight the Army's regulations when you could simply leave the military and stay in Germany as a civilian? The Army considered this mass defiance. In 1948, Army intelligence estimated that approximately 200 former black soldiers had remained in Germany after discharge, specifically to be with German women. The Army had no authority over them as civilians. The regulations had created exactly what they were meant to prevent: permanent interracial families in Europe. Support networks developed. German women married to black soldiers formed mutual aid groups. They shared information about navigating military bureaucracy, helped each other find housing, provided childcare support. Some German churches, particularly Catholic parishes that opposed the Nazi regime, openly welcomed these couples. Pastor Friedrich Weber in Munich organized marriage preparation classes specifically for mixed couples, teaching them about both American and German law, preparing them for challenges they would face. Black soldiers who had received marriage approval shared advice with those still navigating the system. An informal network of sympathetic chaplains and officers passed information about which commands were enforcing regulations strictly and which were allowing discretion. This underground support system operated below the Army's official radar. It couldn't change regulations, but it helped couples survive them. The Army knew about these networks but couldn't stop them without generating negative publicity. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund developed a new legal strategy. They argued that military marriage restrictions violated soldiers' constitutional rights under the First and 14th Amendments. Marriage was a fundamental right. The Army couldn't restrict it based solely on race without compelling governmental interest. The strategy was untested. No federal court had ever ruled on military marriage restrictions. The Defense Fund filed a test case in 1948 on behalf of Sergeant David Coleman, who had been court-martialed for marrying a German woman without authorization. The Army argued that military discipline required authority over soldiers' personal lives, including marriage. The federal district court ruled in the Army's favor, saying military necessity justified the restrictions. The Defense Fund appealed. The case moved slowly through federal courts. While it was pending, it provided hope. Maybe courts would eventually recognize that black soldiers had the same marriage rights as white soldiers, regardless of military service. Each soldier faced an individual calculation. Obey regulations, maintain military career but lose the relationship. Or defy regulations, face court-martial or discharge but stay with the woman you loved. For some, the choice was clear. Private Thomas Green told his commanding officer directly, "I fought fascism for 3 years. I'm not going to let racism tell me who I can love." Green faced court-martial, received a dishonorable discharge, and stayed in Munich with Maria. For others, the calculation was more complicated. Soldiers with families back in the United States, soldiers supporting parents or siblings, soldiers who needed the Army's educational benefits, they had obligations that extended beyond individual relationships. Some chose to end relationships they didn't want to end because the practical consequences were unbearable. There was no right answer. Each man had to decide what he was willing to sacrifice and what price was too high to pay. Some couples tried compromise solutions. Private James Wilson and his German fiancée Anna agreed he would return to the United States first, establish civilian life, then send for her to immigrate as his fiancée rather than as a military dependent. The plan seemed solid. Wilson received honorable discharge in June 1948, returned to Detroit, found a job at Ford Motor Company, and began the immigration sponsorship process. The wait was supposed to be 6 months. It took 3 years. The State Department processed German immigration applications slowly. Former enemy nationals faced additional scrutiny. Applications from German women engaged to black American men faced the slowest processing of all. Wilson sent letters weekly. Anna waited in Munich, working as a seamstress. By the time her visa was finally approved in 1951, they had spent most of their relationship apart. When she arrived in Detroit, they barely recognized each other. The reunion was awkward, strained. They married anyway, hoping proximity would restore what distance had eroded. By 1949, many relationships had failed. The combination of military regulations, bureaucratic delays, material hardship, and long-term separation had broken couples apart. The Army compiled statistics. Of approximately 3,200 marriage applications filed by black soldiers serving in Germany between 1945 and 1949, only 1,100 had been approved. Of those approved marriages, an estimated 40% ended in separation or divorce within 5 years. The Army used these statistics to justify their original restrictions. See, these relationships don't work. What the statistics didn't capture was how Army policies actively sabotaged these relationships. Forced separations, delayed processing, lack of support, hostile enforcement, every institutional barrier made failure more likely. Then the Army used that failure as evidence that black soldiers shouldn't be allowed to marry German women in the first place. The circular logic was perfect. The racism was self-fulfilling, and couples who had survived were exhausted. This is when the story could have ended. Failed experiment, proof that American segregation was right, but something happened that changed everything. In July 1949, the Army discharged 150,000 soldiers as part of post-war demobilization. Among them were hundreds of black soldiers who had been serving in Germany. They faced a choice: return to the United States, to segregation, to states where their marriages might not be recognized, where they and their wives would face discrimination. Or stay in Germany, where they were accepted, where their relationships were normal, where their children wouldn't grow up under Jim Crow. A remarkable number chose to stay. They became permanent residents of Germany, found civilian employment, built lives outside the American military system. The army couldn't stop them. They were no longer soldiers. They were free men making free choices. And their choice was Germany over America. The breakthrough wasn't tactical or technological, it was demographic. By 1950, approximately 1,500 Black American veterans were living permanently in Germany with German wives and families. They became a visible community. In Frankfurt, they established a social club. In Munich, they organized a mutual aid society. In Stuttgart, they created an English language school where German wives could learn English and German children could maintain connection to American culture. These weren't isolated individuals anymore. They were an established community recognized by German authorities, integrated into German society. German churches welcomed them. German employers hired them. German neighbors accepted them. The existence of this community disproved every argument about why these relationships couldn't work. They were working, not because the army had supported them, but because the couples had persevered despite institutional opposition. The community's mere existence was revolutionary. But living in Germany as Black Americans in the 1950s brought new risks. The Cold War was intensifying, Berlin was divided, Soviet espionage was real. American intelligence services were suspicious of Americans who chose to live in Europe permanently, particularly those who had rejected life in the United States. FBI files documented Black veterans living in Germany as potential security risks. The assumption was if they preferred Germany to America, maybe they're vulnerable to Soviet recruitment. This wasn't paranoia. The Soviets did recruit Western expatriates, but the surveillance was also racist. White American expatriates in Europe faced less scrutiny than Black expatriates. Some Black veterans were questioned by U.S. intelligence officers. Were they in contact with Soviet agents? Did they attend communist meetings? Had they made statements critical of the United States? The men who had fought fascism were now suspected of communist sympathies simply because they lived abroad with German wives. The real test came in 1954. The Supreme Court issued its decision in Brown v. Board of Education, declaring school segregation unconstitutional. The decision energized civil rights activists. It also triggered massive resistance from Southern segregationists. In this environment, interracial couples in Germany became symbolically important. They represented what America could become. A society where race didn't determine who you could marry, where children of different backgrounds learned together, where racial hierarchy wasn't enforced by law. American journalists began writing stories about Black GI families in Germany. Life magazine published a photo essay. The stories emphasized how German society had accepted these families, how children attended integrated schools without controversy, how neighbors lived side by side without conflict. The articles didn't explicitly criticize American segregation, but the contrast was obvious. If Germany could integrate, why couldn't America? The publicity brought both support and backlash. Black civil rights organizations celebrated these families as proof that integration worked. White segregationist groups condemned them as evidence of racial mixing's dangers. The families themselves mostly wanted to be left alone. They hadn't chosen to become symbols. They'd just chosen to build lives with the people they loved, but symbolic they were. In 1955, when the Montgomery bus boycott began, Northern newspapers published comparison pieces. In Montgomery, Black Americans were fighting for the right to sit where they wanted on buses. In Germany, Black Americans and white Germans lived as equals. The comparison infuriated segregationists and inspired civil rights activists. The families in Germany received both hate mail from American racists and thank you letters from activists who saw them as proof that America's racial hierarchy wasn't natural or inevitable. It was a choice, and different choices were possible. Some families decided to return to America, not because Germany had rejected them, but because America was changing. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. Legal segregation was under attack. Maybe some thought we can return now. In 1957, Sergeant William Johnson and Hildegard moved to Philadelphia with their 3 children. Johnson had been born in Philadelphia. He wanted his children to know his family, to understand their American heritage. The return was difficult. Pennsylvania didn't have legal segregation like southern states, but discrimination was real. They faced rejection when trying to rent apartments. Employers hesitated to hire Johnson when they learned his wife was white German. Their children faced questions at school. Why does your mother have an accent? Why does she look different than your father? The family persevered. Johnson found work as a mechanic. Hildegard learned English, made friends, became active in their church. But acceptance wasn't universal. In 1958, Johnson was offered a better job in Virginia. The family moved to Richmond. Virginia was still enforcing anti-miscegenation laws. The law, titled the Racial Integrity Act, prohibited marriages between white and non-white people. Johnson and Hildegard's marriage had been legal in Germany and was recognized by federal law. But Virginia refused to recognize it. The state threatened to prosecute them for unlawful cohabitation. Their children's birth certificates were challenged. Virginia law classified children of interracial marriages as illegitimate. The Johnson family faced an impossible choice: leave Virginia or challenge the law in court. They chose to fight. With NAACP Legal Defense Fund support, they filed suit challenging Virginia's anti-miscegenation law as unconstitutional. The case moved through state courts slowly. Meanwhile, they lived under threat of prosecution, their family's legal status in limbo. The legal strategy evolved. Initially, the defense fund argued that Virginia's refusal to recognize a marriage legal in another jurisdiction violated the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution. But Virginia courts rejected this argument. The marriage had occurred in Germany, not another U.S. state. The lawyers pivoted. They argued that Virginia's anti-miscegenation law violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The law discriminated based solely on race. It served no legitimate governmental purpose. It was fundamentally racism codified as law. The argument was straightforward but revolutionary. No federal court had ever struck down a state anti-miscegenation law as unconstitutional. 16 states still enforced such laws in 1960. If Virginia's law fell, similar laws across the South would be vulnerable. The Johnson case wasn't just about one family anymore. It was about whether states could continue using law to enforce racial hierarchy in marriage. Virginia's segregationist establishment reacted furiously. The state attorney general argued that Virginia had the sovereign right to define marriage within its borders, that states had historically regulated marriage, that the federal government had no authority to override state marriage laws. Virginia's brief defended anti-miscegenation laws as protecting both races from the tragedy of racial mixing. The brief cited pseudoscientific studies claiming mixed-race children suffered psychological damage. It quoted religious authorities who argued that God intended races to remain separate. The brief represented segregationist ideology at its most explicit. Racial hierarchy was natural, necessary, and required legal enforcement. Virginia announced it would appeal any adverse ruling all the way to the Supreme Court. Segregationist newspapers ran editorials warning that if states lost the right to prohibit interracial marriage, the entire legal framework of segregation would collapse. They were right. The Johnson family endured 3 years of legal limbo. During that time, they faced harassment, anonymous phone calls at night, threatening letters. Someone threw a brick through their window with a note. Go back to Germany. Their children were bullied at school. Other parents prevented their children from playing with the Johnson kids. Local businesses refused to serve them. The family could have left Virginia, could have moved to a northern state, could have returned to Germany where they were accepted. But Hildegard insisted on staying. She told a reporter, "We left Germany because we believed America was better. If we run away now, we prove the racists right. We stay and fight." Her determination was remarkable. A German woman who had experienced Nazi racism then chose America and was now fighting American racism to make America live up to its own stated values. She wasn't giving up on America. She was demanding America become what it claimed to be. The case nearly collapsed in 1961. The Virginia Supreme Court upheld the state's anti-miscegenation law. The justices ruled that states had traditional authority over marriage and that Virginia's law didn't violate the Constitution because it applied equally to both races. Neither white people nor black people could marry across racial lines. The logic was absurd. A law that prohibited interracial marriage was equal because it restricted everyone equally, but it was legally sophisticated absurdity. The Virginia court cited Pace v. Alabama, an 1883 Supreme Court decision that had upheld anti-miscegenation laws using exactly this reasoning. The decision seemed final. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund immediately appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court had discretion about which cases to hear. If the court declined to hear the case, Virginia's ruling would stand. The Johnsons waited to learn if the Supreme Court would take their case. Then something unexpected happened. The Supreme Court accepted a different case challenging Virginia's anti-miscegenation law, Loving v. Virginia, filed by Richard and Mildred Loving, an interracial couple who had been arrested in 1958 for violating the same law Johnson was challenging. The Lovings' case was stronger procedurally. They had been criminally prosecuted, not just denied marriage recognition. The Supreme Court consolidated several anti-miscegenation challenges, including the Johnson case, to be heard together. Oral arguments were scheduled for April 1967. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, ACLU, and other civil rights organizations filed supporting briefs. The case had grown far beyond one family. 16 states with anti-miscegenation laws watched nervously. Civil rights organizations saw this as potentially the most significant Supreme Court case since Brown v. Board. The outcome would determine whether states could continue using law to enforce racial hierarchy in the most intimate realm of human life, marriage. On June 12, 1967, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Loving v. Virginia. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the unanimous opinion. The court held that Virginia's anti-miscegenation law violated both the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Warren wrote, "Marriage is one of the basic civil rights of man, fundamental to our very existence and survival. To deny this fundamental freedom on so unsupportable a basis as racial classifications embodied in these statutes, depriving all the state's citizens of liberty without due process of law, violates the central meaning of the Equal Protection Clause." The decision was unequivocal. Anti-miscegenation laws were unconstitutional. 16 states' laws were instantly invalidated. Couples like the Johnsons, who had been fighting for recognition of their marriages, were suddenly vindicated. Interracial marriage was now a constitutional right nationwide. The decision's impact was immediate and profound. Couples who had been living in legal limbo were suddenly protected. Couples who had avoided certain states could now travel freely. Children whose legitimacy had been questioned were legally recognized. The Johnson family held a small celebration in their Richmond home. Hildegard cried, not from sadness, but from relief. For 9 years since returning from Germany, they had lived under the threat of prosecution. Now that threat was gone. The Supreme Court had declared that their marriage was legitimate, that their family was legal, that their love was constitutionally protected. The victory belonged to the Lovings, whose names would forever be associated with the case. But it also belonged to the Johnsons and hundreds of other families who had fought for recognition, who had endured harassment, who had refused to accept that America could legislate love across racial lines. They had won. After the celebration ended, there was a strange quiet. The Johnsons sat in their living room that evening, not speaking much. The victory was real, but it couldn't erase the years of struggle. It couldn't undo the harassment, the threats, the brick through the window. It couldn't restore the relationships they'd lost, family members who had rejected them, friends who had abandoned them. The Supreme Court decision meant their marriage was legal. It didn't mean their neighbors suddenly accepted them. It didn't mean the discrimination ended, but something fundamental had shifted. The law was now on their side. Future interracial couples wouldn't have to fight the battles they'd fought. The silence that evening wasn't disappointment. It was exhaustion, relief, and recognition that their sacrifice had meaning beyond their own family. They had helped change America, even if America hadn't yet fully changed. In the years following Loving v. Virginia, interracial marriage rates increased gradually. In 1967, approximately 3% of marriages were interracial. By 1980, that number had risen to 7%. By 2000, it was 15%. The change was generational and geographic. Younger Americans were more accepting than older generations. Urban areas showed higher interracial marriage rates than rural areas, but the trend was consistent. The legal barriers' removal gradually reduced social stigma. The families who had pioneered interracial marriage in the 1940s and 50s watched this change with complex emotions. They were vindicated, their relationships, once illegal, were now recognized, but they also knew how difficult their path had been. Many had lost family relationships, job opportunities, social standing. The younger generation marrying across racial lines didn't always understand what earlier pioneers had sacrificed, but that was the point. Progress meant future generations wouldn't need to fight the same battles. Stories about Black GI families in Germany continued to emerge. Historians began researching occupation-era relationships. Oral history projects interviewed couples who had met in post-war Germany. A pattern emerged. These relationships had succeeded despite institutional opposition, not because of institutional support. The couples who survived were those with exceptional determination, those who built support networks, those who were willing to sacrifice career advancement for personal relationships. Sociologists studying these families found something unexpected. Children from these families showed higher rates of cross-cultural competence, foreign language fluency, and international perspective than children from monoracial families. Growing up between cultures, between languages, between nations, gave these children unique advantages. What American racism had treated as a weakness, mixed racial heritage, was actually producing adaptive, resilient, culturally sophisticated individuals. The military families who returned to America brought this international perspective into American communities. The U.S. military never officially apologized for its discriminatory marriage policies, but institutional practices changed. By 1970, the military had abandoned race-specific marriage restrictions. Soldiers of any race could marry foreign nationals with command approval, regardless of racial matching. The approval process still existed. The military maintained authority over soldiers' personal lives, but race was no longer an explicit factor. In 1995, the Army published a historical study of race relations in the post-war occupation. The study acknowledged that marriage restrictions had been discriminatory and had damaged morale among black soldiers. The study stopped short of apologizing, but noted that policies based on racial assumptions rather than military necessity undermined the values American forces claimed to defend. It was bureaucratic language, carefully hedged. But it was acknowledgement. The institution that had enforced segregation was admitting its policies had been wrong. By the 2000s, military interracial marriage was common and unremarkable. Approximately 15% of military marriages were interracial, higher than the civilian rate of 12%. Military bases were among the most integrated spaces in American society. Base housing, schools, churches, recreation facilities, all fully integrated, all normalizing interracial families. This wasn't because the military had become progressive. It was because military policy, once it abandoned formal discrimination, created conditions where integration became practical reality. Soldiers from different backgrounds served together, socialized together, formed relationships together. The institutional barriers that had prevented interracial relationships in the 1940s were gone. What remained was human connection unmediated by institutional racism. The military, which had pioneered segregation in the early 20th century, had become a leading force for integration by the early 21st century. The irony wasn't lost on historians studying this transformation. Researchers studying interracial marriage outcomes found consistent patterns. Interracial marriages in the military showed similar or slightly better stability rates compared to same-race marriages. Children from interracial military families showed no disadvantages in educational achievement, psychological well-being, or social adjustment compared to children from same-race families. In fact, some studies showed advantages. Higher cultural competence, greater empathy, more sophisticated understanding of identity. The racist predictions that had justified marriage restrictions, that interracial marriages would be unstable, that mixed-race children would be damaged, were empirically false. The Johnson family exemplified these patterns. Their 3 children all graduated college, 2 became teachers, 1 became a social worker, all married and raised their own families. The grandchildren of William Johnson and Hildegard grew up in an America where their grandparents' marriage was legally protected, and where their own mixed heritage was source of pride, not shame. In 2017, 50 years after Loving v. Virginia, historians organized a symposium on interracial military families. William Johnson, then 93 years old, was invited to speak. He and Hildegard, 91, traveled to Washington, D.C. for the event. Johnson told the story of their meeting in Stuttgart in 1945, the piano wire tensioner Wait, Wrong Story. He told their story. Meeting during the occupation, falling in love, facing the Army's opposition, enduring years of legal limbo, the harassment in Virginia, the vindication of the Loving decision. He spoke for 30 minutes. The audience, historians, civil rights activists, younger interracial couples, listened in silence. When he finished, Hildegard stood to speak. She said simply, "We just wanted to be together. We didn't want to be symbols. But if our stubbornness helped other people, I'm glad." The audience stood and applauded for 5 minutes. History was honoring them. The Johnson story is one of thousands. Thousands of Black American soldiers who met German women in the aftermath of World War II. Thousands of couples who faced institutional opposition, social stigma, legal barriers. Some relationships didn't survive those pressures, but many did. Those couples, through their persistence, helped dismantle legal barriers to interracial marriage. Their lawsuits challenged anti-miscegenation laws. Their existence proved that interracial families could thrive. Their children and grandchildren carried forward a living refutation of racist ideology. This wasn't the conventional civil rights narrative of marches and protests. It was quieter, more personal. It was people choosing love over conformity, choosing human connection over institutional hierarchy, choosing to build families that violated racial boundaries. Their resistance was domestic, intimate, daily, but it was resistance nonetheless, and it contributed to transforming America's understanding of race, family, and belonging. William Johnson died in 2019 at age 95. Hildegard followed 6 months later at 93. They had been married 70 years. At the funeral, their children spoke about their parents' determination, their refusal to accept that society could dictate whom they loved. Their grandchildren spoke about growing up with a German grandmother whose accent never faded, who taught them to speak German, who made Stalin at Christmas and told them stories about surviving the war. Their great-grandchildren, some of whom were too young to understand funerals fully, represented something profound. A multiracial, multicultural family that existed only because 2 people in 1945 had met amid the ruins of war and chosen each other. The pianist played Lily Marleen, the song that both German and Allied soldiers had sung during the war. In the audience, other elderly interracial couples from the occupation era wept. They knew what it had cost. They knew what it had meant. They had loved it. The story of Black American soldiers and German women in post-war Germany teaches us something essential about human connection and institutional power. Racism functions through institutions, laws, military regulations, social norms that enforce hierarchy and separation. But racism is ultimately a human creation, and humans can choose differently. The couples who defied military regulations and anti-miscegenation laws weren't heroes in the conventional sense. They were ordinary people who made a simple choice to be together, regardless of institutional opposition. Their choice was radical precisely because it was ordinary. They didn't seek to dismantle segregation through their relationships. They just wanted to build families, but in doing so and persisting despite opposition, they helped transform America, not through speeches or legislation primarily, but through lived example. They proved that the boundaries racism drew were artificial, arbitrary, and ultimately unable to contain human connection. When we look back at the 1940s and 50s, it's easy to see the racism clearly. Anti-miscegenation laws seem obviously unjust now, but in that era they were defended by legislators, judges, religious leaders, citizens who believed racial separation was natural and necessary. The couples who defied those laws faced real consequences, lost jobs, family rejection, legal prosecution, social ostracism. They persisted not knowing that future generations would view them as pioneers. They couldn't see 2025, couldn't know that interracial marriage would become common and legally protected. They acted on faith in their relationships, faith that their choice was right despite what society said. That faith was validated by history, but they didn't have history's validation when they needed courage. They had only their commitment to each other, and somehow that was enough. This is the story they didn't teach you in school. The story of Black American soldiers who were told they'd be unwanted in Germany, who found acceptance instead. The story of German women who had been told Black people were inferior, who chose Black American soldiers as husbands anyway. The story of couples who faced down both Nazi racial ideology and American segregation. The story of families that existed as living proof that racial hierarchy was a lie. Their story is American history. It's civil rights history, it's military history, it's German history, it's human history. If this forgotten story resonated with you, please like this video. Subscribe to hear more untold histories of courage and resistance. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you've heard this story before. Thank you for listening to this history. Thank you for keeping these stories alive. And remember, the boundaries that divide us are never as strong as the connections that unite us.